Hi, I'm Tom Payton, Director and Publisher of Trinity University Press. Thanks for joining us for the Maverick Book Club. The books we discuss in this series explore the rich stories of Texas, but in this first season, we're focused on our hometown, San Antonio. From a provocative look at life here during World War II and the representation of the city through the lens of vintage postcards, to the culturally diverse day-by-day history of the city in San Antonio 365, which we're discussing this evening, and a discussion about researching and writing Black history in our city that's upcoming. Our series aims to be as diverse as the city itself. Enjoy yourself, ask questions, and at the end, don't forget to check out the book that we'll all be reading and talking about next month, which is available to you, of course, at a special price. In the meantime, I'll hand it off to Lilly Gonzalez, Director of the San Antonio Book Festival, who will start our discussion. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Maverick Book Club. We'd like you all to be a part of the conversation, so we encourage you to submit your questions throughout the hour by typing them into the Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye out for those. Tonight, I have the distinct privilege to be talking with two of my favorite people in San Antonio, Yvette Benavides and David Martin Davies, the co-authors of San Antonio 365 on This Day in History. Yvette D. Benavides is a professor of creative writing at Our Lady of the Lake University and a commentator on Texas Public Radio. She contributes book reviews to the San Antonio Express News, and she is the editor of Trinity University Press's series EQ, Creative Nonfiction on Social Equity. David Martin Davies is a veteran journalist with more than 30 years of experience covering Texas, the border, and Mexico. He's the host of The Source and Texas Matters on Texas Public Radio. His reporting has been recognized with numerous awards, including the 2019 National Edward R. Murrow Award for Radio Documentary. Hi guys, it's good to see you.
Hi Lily.
Hey Lily.
So let's just dive right in. This is a San Antonio history book, but it's not like any history book that I've ever come across. It has roots in other projects that you both have worked on. So why don't you tell us how the book came to be?
And Yvette, how did the book come to be?
Okay. Well, it started out as this radio project. We did these daily tricentennial minutes Monday through Friday for Texas Public Radio in 2018 to help observe and celebrate the 300th anniversary of our city. The response was so tremendous. People would tell them back to me. People who had heard them on the, on the radio that day would tell them back to me, or they would ask me questions, or they wanted more information. And there was just such a tremendous response that we knew that there was something kind of special about this process of excavating certain events and characters in our research.
Yeah, and prior to that, I had been working, kind of kicked off my process of investigating San Antonio history. I worked on a documentary project about W. Lee Pass the Biscuits Pappy O'Daniel, who was the governor of Texas, some would say the worst governor in the history of Texas, and how he, his rise from a flower salesman on the radio with the Hillbilly Band to becoming Texas governor and then a US Senator from Texas. And it was so bizarre, and I went through old newspapers down at the San Antonio Public Library, going through their Texana collection, going through the microfiche and reading all these newspapers. And in the process, seeing other stories along the way that I didn't know about San Antonio history. And I was just gobsmacked that that's when I came across a headline talking about the cross burning at the Woodlawn Lake Pool because of the Juneteenth protest of some African-American children that dared to go swim at the whites-only swimming pool in San Antonio. And I was just astonished because I had swam in that pool as a kid. I worked as a lifeguard there in my teens. This was, we lived in that neighborhood, and yet this was a part of San Antonio that I didn't know anything about.
Right.
And I kept doing more reading and research and kind of got addicted to reading old newspapers in San Antonio and finding more and more. And I would tell people, did you know this happened? And did you hear about this? And and start reading about some of the names that we were familiar with in San Antonio, like Callahan. Well, who's Callahan? Why do we have roads named for this guy Callahan? Well, in fact, it was a Callahan family. It was 3 generations of mayors in San Antonio. One of them was King Callahan, who was a very powerful mayor. And he says, why are these things not available to us? Why do I have to go searching for them? What else about San Antonio history don't we know? And from there, when we did the Tricentennial Minutes and we pitched that to Texas Public Radio to have that on the air, like in December of 2017, it's like, hey, the Tricentennial's next month. Let's start doing this project. And they said, okay, go for it. And we did it. And so that worked forth. And then from that, we produced a comic book about San Antonio history. Hector Garza did the wonderful art for this. And we wanted to tell some of San Antonio's stories this way. This is a kind of a disruption to the history of San Antonio that people typically know about. So we have like the Freedom Swim here that I talk about. It's on Lake Pool, and what happened to the Chili Queens, and other stories in here that are important. And that kind of came about from this book, which was published in Texas in the 1920s. So this was called Texas History Movies. And this was like a comic book. This was before there were like comic book was available to a lot of people. This was published in the 20s by Magnolia Oil Gasoline. And it was distributed to every school kid in Texas. And it was a racist view of Texas history. And this was very instrumental in formulating and crystallizing what Texas history is and how it should be taught and what kids should know. And how Texas was taken away from Mexico and become this wonderful, great state. And so, but the images are so powerful and they burn into your cerebellum. You just have them in there. And we wanted to try and say, well, let's counter that. Let's come up with other images. Here's the back image of someone reading a book. Important. And we wanted to do that. So I guess that's a kind of convoluted answer to the story. And so, okay, what happens next? And said, well, I guess this is the next book. So yeah.
Yeah, we wanted to go beyond the one-page story in the comic book and then the 39 seconds radio spot. It just felt like this would be an opportunity for us to expand some of the stories or connect some of the stories. And we were able to identify some through lines and some themes and elevate those a little bit as well.
And also counter the ephemeral nature of radio, and it's powerful when you hear it, but it's no longer there, it's gone. What can we do to make this stick so that this sits on, people pick it up, they can refer back to it. Hopefully it'll be around for a while.
So I want to touch on the book's structure for a little bit. It's 365 days of the year and the chapters are months. So you'll have the month of January is a chapter and so on. And I just want to, let everybody know that it's a perfect book to read at any time, but especially right now in this moment that we're living in, because so many of us are suffering from like the shortest attention spans of our lifetimes. So from a reader's perspective, I found the length of the moments in history so digestible right now when I find that it's hard to focus on like a novel or something like that. And if something piqued my curiosity, I could just go and do some research of my own. But I'm curious, from a writer's perspective, was it difficult to condense a historical moment into a brief summary?
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, it was always a struggle to remember that this was supposed to be a capsulization, and it doesn't really serve history well to do that. You're trying to give the impression that this event happened on this one day, and you bring it down. And frequently, history doesn't happen in a day, and it can't, and it's not often as simple as it's laid out to be. So there was always a struggle to not get sucked into giving the full and great total explanation of what this means. So like talking about, I don't know, so like in January 11th, 1954, Gus Garcia goes to the Supreme Court and he argues about a class apart, about how Mexican Americans in Texas deserve to be covered and be recognized as a protected class and deserve coverage of the 14th Amendment. And that's a very complicated thing to express. And there have been entire books written about that, and the great character of Gus Garcia and his tragic story, and documentaries have been made about this. And then we want to make sure that we include it in a book, but you know, unfortunately, we can't really give this incredible individual and this incredible story the full treatment that it deserves. But hopefully we will spark someone who didn't know about this. They will say, they will Google it, or they will pursue it, or when they see that there's a movie coming out about Gus Garcia, they will say, I remember that, and I know this is, and they will pursue it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly what happened. I wound up doing that with a lot of them. So I'll confess that I have a lot of gaps in my knowledge of San Antonio history. I just moved here 5 years ago, so there was a lot that I didn't know. And with everything that's going on in our cities right now, you know, the protests that were triggered after the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police, coronavirus, the unrest in the streets, the movement calling for police reform, all of that, I really felt that it was incumbent upon me to learn about the injustices here in our own city. San Antonio is not immune to incidents of police brutality and wrongdoing, as I learned in your book. So in recent history, 2 Black men, Marquise Jones and Charles Roundtree Jr., were killed by police officers under suspect circumstances. Their families, if you've been watching the news, they're still seeking justice, and there have been many others. So can you just talk about the history of police brutality in San Antonio and what you found in your research?
Well, I will say just more generally that you can draw some lines to incremental change in social and racial justice throughout this book. There are small steps, and I mean, even if you read it sort of casually, you know, open it up on any page, but if you look at, and there's not an, obviously there's not an arc over the structure of the book, but you can start to see the small steps and then the bigger moments in history that illustrate progress, but also obviously regression, as we've already noted here in our discussion so far. I mean, you can have a very long memory of history, but sometimes, as you say, our attention span is so abbreviated. But yes, you can flip through the book and find these particular events, and you know, they're not the kinds of things that we want to necessarily herald as, you know, a chapter in our history, but we have to, right? Yeah. We have to do that. So so do you want to add anything to that? I mean, specific events or specific stories from the book?
Right. So for example, on the page first, on January 1st, that's when we first reference police chief and then later Sheriff Owen Kilday. And Owen Kilday was the longest serving sheriff in Bexar County history. And before that, he was a police chief. And he was known for his brutal tactics against the pecan sheller strikers that were led by Emma Tenayuca, that they would turn the fire hoses on them. They would beat them with clubs. They were not gentle with dealing with pecan workers or any other people that dared to question the superiority of the white ruling class of San Antonio at the time. And so just for example, on April 15th, 1938, you know, Owen Kilday leads a raid on Emma Tenayuca's little headquarters that she has in San Antonio. It's like 307 Commerce Street, which is like right by where we are right now. Mm-hmm. And he calls it, this was a school for communists. And they go in with all of his police officers and they rush in and they smash every stick of furniture. They tear apart all the literature. They smash typewriters. And this is what Emma Tenayuka and her cohorts were using to try to educate and reach out to farm workers in the area, letting them know about their rights, and they were trying to help them negotiate and get better treatment as farm workers, and that made them communists, and the police were used as a goon squad in order to smash that up. Emma Tenayuka is also a recurring character in the book, and we talk about her arc as well, and many people are familiar with her, but they don't really understand, for example, the pecan shelter strike is like, well, yeah, there's a pecan shelter strike, what makes sense, you know, but it was very difficult to bring about that strike. There had been strikes before, and they had failed, and there were efforts to counter them, and there were people on the payroll from the pecan shelling companies to disrupt the strikes and infiltrate these groups, and it took someone like Emma Tenayuka to inspire confidence, loyalty, and her integrity, and in order to lead this group of people in San Antonio for better pay and treatment. And we see how there's that conflict today between young people. She was in her 20s, early 20s during this time, and how we have people of that age now fighting for similar circumstances of fair treatment, justice, looking for being able to assert your civil rights without getting your head bashed in.
Yeah, I was saddened to read that there are moments in San Antonio's history when even when the police force is, you know, actively supporting peaceful protest, it's the citizens of San Antonio that might act against the progress that the protesters are fighting for. So, for example, the lunch counter integration, where, you know, the police were saying, we're not going to disturb the protests if it's peaceful. And then you had crosses burned later in the day, just as an act of like,
Sure, in Travis Park.
yeah.
And so the San Antonio lunch counter integration story, a lot of people are familiar with that, and how that came about. It was because the local NAACP contacted the Chamber of Commerce and said, we are going to begin our protest if we don't drop down this segregated barrier. And and so the lunch counters, they agreed, and they allowed this to move forward. But like you said, people aren't familiar with San Antonio history, that there was a presence of the Ku Klux Klan here. We did have cross burnings in San Antonio, and particularly right after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, that became more prominent. So there's always going to be people who want to hold progress back, but then there's, as long as there's people, a strong voice, organized, who want to move forward, they'll find a way.
So is there hope to be gleaned from looking at the past? Can you talk about moments where protests and organized activism did lead to reforms?
Well, there's a lot of those.
Yeah.
A lot. You know, one of my biggest moments of hope I think about is actually happened on July 21st, 1865. And that is when the American flag was hoisted back over the Alamo after the Civil War. It marked the end of the Civil War in San Antonio. And we talk about in the book how the Civil War almost broke out in San Antonio with General Twigg, and how the surrender of the Alamo, and very nearly it could have broken out into gunfire, and the Civil War would have started here in San Antonio. But it's interesting. So right after the end of the Civil War, this Wilhelm, I think his name is Thailand Pape. He's a German guy. He he was appointed as mayor of San Antonio right after the Civil War during Reconstruction. And he got the city back on its feet during this time. But before that, they held this little ceremony, him and a few friends. They uncorked a bottle of wine at the Alamo, hoisted the Union flag, and they sang patriotic songs. And that's how they marked the end of the Civil War. And to me, that was, I mean, I thought that would have, it's a beautiful moment that I discovered reading and had not really, there's not a lot about that. And I think that we should remember that.
Yeah. So I want to move on, and I want to talk about another really relevant topic for our times, the history of public health. But I want to acknowledge the historic moment that we're living in. I think it's like day 12 of protests nationwide. For me, this moment, is somebody on? For me, this movement has really illuminated just how much pain is in our communities right now, and just the centuries of injustice that have erupted in this very palpable anguish. So in the book, every month is prefaced with an essay that Yvette wrote. For example, the month of August has this beautiful essay that's like an ode to libraries. And I wanted to ask you to read from the September essay because it talks about the responsibility that we have to alleviate one another's pain. And I just find that so resonant right now. So
I sure will. Let me see.
196.
I'll start, it's kind of in the middle of the essay. On May 30th, 1858, 4 men were hanged from a tree near Mission San Jose. The 4 were Mexican. Their names were Francisco Huizan, Pablo Longoria, Felipe Lopez, and Nicanor Urdiales. Without evidence or due process, a secret vigilante group had accused the 4 men of stealing horses and lynched them. What a gruesome image emerges in the mind's eye. Texas history is full of lynching victims who were Black, Mexican, Mexican-American, Native American, victims numbering in the hundreds. San Antonio had its share of such acts, and we should remember this part of our painful past. Susan Sontag wrote that to make peace is to forget. To reconcile, it is necessary that memory be faulty and limited. If the goal is having some space in which to live one's own life, then it is desirable that the account of specific injustices dissolve into a more general understanding that human beings everywhere do terrible things to one another. We can turn away, change the channel, move the needle of our vicarious pain scale to 0, but that action can never remove what an image or a story conveys. Denizens of a city make an implicit pact with their neighbors. If we are susceptible to illness and pain because of proximity, we have likewise entered into a contract to help each other resolve our problems. It is our responsibility for sharing common rights and observing the same laws to help alleviate each other's pain. Our emphatic intentions should be infectious. What is a city if not a collection of people brought together by dint of destiny to do just that?
Thank you. Thank you for reading that.
Thanks.
I just want to, there's some people that have joined since I said, so if you have any questions, please go ahead and submit them to the Q&A. I see one, we're gonna touch on that, so I'm gonna hold off on sharing that question. Okay, so, it seems like a lot of people have forgotten, but we're in a global pandemic that's still happening. And it was fascinating to learn about, San Antonio's long history of dealing with epidemics and, enacting these reforms afterwards. So can you talk about some of those reforms, any parallels that you saw or find between those moments and the pandemic that we're in now?
Well, so as you know from the book, in 1849, there were 500 deaths because of the cholera outbreak. And soon after, in 1866, there were 292 more deaths. So the latter of these 2 episodes led to reform. in the city's infrastructure and public city services.
Yeah, so Ms. Interrupt, so what that meant was there was a realization that pools of water, stagnant water, uh, and this lack of sanitation in San Antonio was spreading cholera. And it was after that last epidemic that the city invested finally in gutters and curbs and tried to move stagnant water out of the city, out of living areas to reduce the cholera. And it worked, but it did take investment from the city of San Antonio to accomplish that. And this just shows you, the city can do things to improve general welfare, and it just needs the leadership to do that.
And then to answer the question, to go a little bit further, the May 12th entry, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to read that. This was in 1946. A polio epidemic shuts down San Antonio. Sound familiar? The Board of Health ordered an immediate closing of public and private schools in the city. Breckenridge and all other parks, as well as theaters, dance halls, and other gathering places downtown and north of Commerce Street were off limits to anyone under the age of 21. Swimming pools were closed, as were rivers and streams used for swimming. The sale of unpasteurized milk was prohibited. The drastic measures were ordered after 8 cases of polio were diagnosed in 6 days. 4 of those were fatal. So, and it goes on. Mayor Gus B. Marmon accepted an offer of 17 planes to spray the city with DDT. A citywide door-to-door cleanup campaign was announced to address open garbage pits, cesspools, and unsanitary outhouses and privies. So,
yeah, so when people think about what's happening now with the shutdown response to COVID-19, we realize if you have perspective, this has happened before. So I think it was Winston Churchill that talked about history, saying the further back you look, the further ahead you can see. And that knowing how the city has reacted in the past and what those results were and what the missteps were and the pushback that we got on some of these things, we get an idea of what's happening now and how that we've been here before. So during the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, the city was very slow to respond to that. San Antonio was one of the first cities hit by that because of our military presence. And San Antonio was very heavily dealt with that flu.
Yeah.
The health commandments.
Oh yeah, so the commandments of health. Okay. So
do you want to read it?
I guess I'll try to read it.
I can read it.
Okay, so on December 22nd, 1883, a public posting is made detailing new city rules for public health and sanitation. The ordinance covered assorted categories of filth, cesspools, decaying matter, human waste, and other substances detrimental to human health. Household privies were required to be at least 3 feet from adjoining lots, 5 feet from any street and public place, 10 feet from any ditch, river, or public stream. So the city was telling people, you've got to get activated and you have to be responsible. And that the city says they're going to go out and make sure and follow up and see that you are dealing with this in a responsible manner. And they were going to have to disinfect these dwellings every 2 weeks, these privies, these outhouses that people had, and it was a big deal. Also, in the newspaper at the time, reading about calls for action, there was this 10 commandments of public health that they wanted people to know, calling for people to clean up after their animals and cover their trash cans and be proactive, because they knew that we were all in this city together and that disease can easily become a major problem. And public health is a central part of what a city needs to be involved with. So we came back to that theme over and over again in telling these stories. And this is before, long before this COVID-19 situation occurred. We just recognized that these were important stories, and it highlighted how leadership in these areas are critical for having a successful city.
Yeah. The commandment in the January 23rd moment, it says, "Thou shalt clean out the habitation of thy horse." And, you know, I just, of course, it makes me wonder, like, what would the health commandments look like today? Thou shalt wear a mask.
Yeah. Wash your hands.
Yeah, thou
20
shalt.
seconds to the happy birthday song.
So I'm interested to hear from you about your research process for this book. Obviously, I know a lot of the work had been done for the earlier projects that you talked about, but I mean, this just seems like hours of work for one moment. And the question that somebody has, if you could address that too, is did you have a set number of stories allotted to different categories? Was there a category that seemed to dominate the book?
I wish we could say that we were that that deliberate about it. I mean, it was really kind of organic, and it really depended on, well, a number of things. The research, right? So believe it or not, sometimes it was really hard to find something to write about on a particular day. And it took a lot of time to find that nugget. And other times there were so many competing stories that it was hard to know which one to focus on for the book. We did realize early on that there were recurring characters and recurring themes and recurring subjects, and we let that happen. I mean, even to the point maybe of being a little bit redundant, and then, you know, we could try to rein that in a little bit. But yeah, lots of hours. Yeah. Yes.
And so sometimes I would think, like, I knew certain stories about San Antonio, and I wanted to make sure they got in the book, like the Lanier basketball riot. That was important, which is when Lanier High School won the city basketball championship, and people were so upset that this team of Mexican Americans would beat the dominant Anglo team in San Antonio, that the whole gymnasium broke out in fisticuffs, and they stormed the court and attacked the players from the Lanier High School. And that's a fascinating story. And so we got to get this in the book, and we did a lot of research in that. Sometimes I thought about people in San Antonio's history that I really wanted to make sure that they got their space in the book. I thought about, like, Senator Joe Bernal. You know, I wanted to make sure he got a salute in the book. I think of him as very important for San Antonio, and I write about him in February 25th, 1971, and about how he fought against this voter registration law that we had at the time that required people to register to vote every year. You know, you couldn't have a voter registration that lasted year to year to year like we have now. And he fought and said this was just something that was burdensome. It was designed to keep Mexican Americans and people of color, poor people from voting. And finally, the Supreme Court in 1966, you know, they had ruled that the poll tax was violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, and they got rid of that. And this was the response from the Texas legislature to come up with this annual voter registration. So they're always coming up with, and it's the same argument. So that's another thing we wanted to draw out. We see the same arguments again and again about why we can't have wider participation in our election system now. And that's one of the say, okay, here's something that Joe Bernal did. He spoke out and fought for the elimination and was able to bring support for the permanent voter registration law in Texas. And so there's a lot of things in there that we wanted to include because I think some stories were almost in this mist of almost forgotten history that we had to reach into and bring back into the world today. And I wanted to push those forward into the future so that other people won't forget that.
We have another question from the audience. If you changed the title to 365 Dallas or Houston, would it be a very different book? In other words, is San Antonio unique as a city, or are these narratives mostly the same in the life of a given city?
Oh, I'd have to say they'd be very different.
very different because, well, San Antonio has a lot more history to tell than Dallas or Houston. We're a much older city. These are other cities. One of the nuts I'm always trying to crack is that okay, so San Antonio is a much older city. For a long time, it was the largest city in Texas. Why did San Antonio falter? Why did we fade away? And, it's still a major city in Texas, but it's not Dallas, it's not Houston. What happened there? What did Dallas have that San Antonio didn't have that allowed it to flourish at the time? And I have to, and particularly when it comes to aviation, that was really where San Antonio fell behind, was when during the age of commercial aviation. And why did San Antonio, we were well positioned to become a leader in commercial aviation why aren't we an airport hub? And it really came down to the fact that this was an era when San Antonio had really bad local leadership. And we had a bad city charter. We had people in power who were not interested in trying to grow the city. They were more interested in trying to hang on to what they had at the time. And so, but to the question about, yeah, it would be different. Every city has its own character, has its own soul. And I think that and that's one thing we really wanted to get at, what was San Antonio's character? We had a lot of stories that we would come across that we'd figure, oh, Harry Houdini comes to San Antonio. He hangs upside down from the light pole in front of the city hall, and he's in a straitjacket, and he escapes in front of throngs of hundreds of people who are just, slack-jawed, amazed at how wonderful this is. And we don't put that in the story because Harry Houdini went to every city in the United States and pulled that same stunt. So it didn't really express anything about San Antonio. And so the stories that we looked for, we really tried to find stories that really were puro San Antonio.
Hopefully other people in the audience are dying to know, but like real talk, what is it like working as husband and wife on a project like this? Obviously you like it, you keep doing it. So.
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Fun. It's fun.
Fun? All right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've spent more time together. I mean, we'll be married 25 years, September 9th, right? September 9th. But I don't think we've ever spent quite so much time together.
I mean, we worked on projects before. We did, Texas Matters on TPR.
Sure.
Initially. We did that together. And
but this really was hours and hours over, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Friday afternoon, and all day Saturday and all day Sunday.
Well, I worked every night on it.
And yeah, and it's very intensive. But I mean, it was a real passion project. I'm not originally from San Antonio, but I've been here since.
From Laredo?
I'm from Laredo originally. Now that would be an interesting 365. No, it's been a great experience. It's I research in a very different way, and I learned a lot about research from Dave, and he has all kinds of ways of utilizing the library that I thought I knew all about it. And he really is just a very deep researcher. It's really, and he always has been, but it was really special to be able to research together, right? This was sort of like the first time we really went into a project like this together. We're both very sort of solitary and introverted on our own.
Yeah.
And we have our individual projects that we do, but yeah, no, it had its challenging moments, and it was a lot of work, and it was very stressful, but it was sure worth it.
But
Yeah.
Yvette wrote the essays that are in the book, one for every month. And they are incredibly well written and deeply felt. I like how Yvette gets to like the fifth element of all these stories, of how they're just beyond trying to connect people, how these things felt, what do they mean, and how they impact your soul. And she can only do that in a way that I would never be able to do. So I think that she it's not just a collection of these dates. Like, I didn't want it to be just a collection of trivia. These are stories to be told. And her essays find that connective tissue, and they bring that out. And they're so well written and incredibly moving that I think that really makes the book.
Aw, when teamwork goes right. In the foreword to the book, you write about the challenge of relying on newspapers of the past because they often reflect the oppression of the times. So, Dave, as the deep diver into research, tell us what you found.
Well, it was really harsh. The hard part was what we didn't find. Mm-hmm. So, of course, you don't see a lot of coverage of LGBTQ in the newspapers going back. You don't see a lot of sensitive coverage of what it was like to live in the barrios in San Antonio, African-American community. There's no sort of take on what's it like to live in San Antonio as an African-American family during the age of Jim Crow, when, San Antonio had Jim Crow. And those were what I wanted to find out. Those are the stories I wanted to tell. The newspapers were just they're instruments of the Chamber of Commerce, and they want to tell a story, and they're very much, we call them Homer newspapers. Are about, they want to present a positive story about San Antonio. And when Eleanor Roosevelt came to San Antonio and she visited the West Side and she saw how horrible it was, the horrible conditions. First of all, you read the local newspapers about that at the time, and there's no coverage of her going to the West Side and seeing the barrios. It's about her going to having these ladies' lunches and being presented some knickknack by the Women's Club. And then it was not until Eleanor Roosevelt wrote a daily column, and she writes in there in the national column about how horrible the conditions were in San Antonio, and she called them the worst that she had seen in the country. And she is attacked in the local newspaper for days after this, saying that she was wrong and this was not true. And then Eleanor Roosevelt did fight for public housing in San Antonio in the Alazan Apache courts and getting those greenlit. And San Antonio was not willing to allow that public housing project to come about until she fought for them and pushed that through. So you see the limitations of the local media at the time. It does make you wonder about the limitations that we have today and whether or not the full stories are being told now. And the papers that we have today they do a much better job. There's more diversity in the newsrooms. We need more. And, but there's still a debt to be paid. When the papers at the time were reinforcing these Jim Crow stereotypes and running cartoons in the newspapers that were just derogatory and against African Americans, Mexican Americans, and you wonder, how did this happen? How could this be? And there was no one who had a voice that was powerful enough to challenge that. So that was a limitation that we ran up against all the time. And so all the more important that we reach out to people today, ask them about their family stories. A lot of these stories that are in this book are stories that are told around kitchen tables, over domino tables, at the local ice house. I remember first hearing about Gus Garcia when I was at an ice house playing pool and hearing about this guy, Gus Garcia. And I knew there was a school name for him, but I didn't know who he was. And this incredible story, his tragic arc. So these stories need to be captured. They need to be saved, and they need to be pushed forward so that everyone else can really understand what it was like to live in San Antonio during these difficult times. And Yvette, what's your take on that? I mean, and also the story of women, the gender issues, is the same thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's something to think about. I was reading this note about newspapers that between 1970 and 2016, 500 dailies went out of business. And in 2017 through 2018, 1/3 of the nation's largest newspapers folded, or they went online, right? So there's all this transition now. And it makes me think about what are the limitations to come potentially because of this, because of something like this. So if the coverage was so incomplete, or it was so limited, or it was so skewed back in the day, and now, the quote from Churchill, right? Now I'm sort of looking at this trend with newspapers in contemporary times, and yeah, I'm worried. So we had like this treasure trove of newspapers to help us do our research, but I really wonder what future researchers will have at their disposal. It seems like we all have a lot of access to information, but I do worry, right? I do worry a lot about books. I worry about the publishing world. I worry about libraries. I worry about all kinds of things, and even what's available digitally.
Right. A lot of our information is really tied to the moment. So we're, Twitter feeds and Facebook posts and all this other stuff is about the moment, the moment, the moment. What's that going to look like going forward? How is that going to be preserved for 20, 50, 100 years from now? And how will people access that if they're trying to figure out what was it like to live during this time? If nothing exists on paper or any other firm, concrete method, whether it be chiseled in stone or something, how is that going to be saved and transferred to the future?
Yeah. I also wonder, if somebody were trying to capture the moment that we're living in now, not even 10 years in the future, just a year from now or whatever, how you would do that without Twitter, just because Twitter has documented this moment, I think, better than a lot of mainstream media. And that's just the limitations of keeping up with every single thing that's happening across the nation.
Yeah.
We have a couple questions on the resources that you used. People want to know if there were any Spanish language papers that you came across that reflected the Mexican, Tejano, Mexican-American experience, and were you able to use any neighborhood or ethnically oriented publications?
So in San Antonio, we had La Prensa, and the original La Prensa, and it was really important newspaper in Spanish. And we have it. We have it we talk about the publication of La Prensa, and it came about during the Spanish Revolution, Mexican Revolution, and we had a lot of people in San Antonio who were displaced from the revolution, and this was a way to communicate, tell their story, document them, and help make them aware what was happening in Mexico and the United States at the time. And so it was the first major Spanish language daily in the United States here.
But access for the research,
that's available, and so we're able to look at that, but still it was very limited. The San Antonio Register was the African-American newspaper, real important newspaper nationally. It was run out of San Antonio. It documented a lot of lynchings that were happening across the South, which is one of the hard parts of what's happening, is this denial. It wasn't that bad, or how many were there, or where did they take place. And so the Register is an important newspaper for all sorts of scholars. And we did, index that and look at that and try and keep track. And when there were major events, turn to that newspaper to find out what they had on it. But these are limited as well. And but there is a complete Register newspaper archive at the San Antonio Public Library, and the San Antonio Public Library was very helpful in making this book happen and pointing me in some directions to look and getting help.
You know, in the editing process, there's a phrase that writers use to describe cutting out the parts of a book that the author really loves, but that they aren't necessarily serving the plot or the narrative. That phrase is kill your darlings. So I wanted to ask you if you killed any darlings during the editing process, but I also want to tie that into another question that we had. Somebody's asking, did you write a story for February 29th?
Oh, for leap year, I don't think we did.
I wanted to.
I think we had enough work to do.
I knew that question was going to be asked.
And so, did we? No, we didn't. It's like, no, we didn't. So I guess call me lazy, but we didn't do it. I don't think we'd have to change the name of the book, I think. So, and what was the other?
Did you cut anything out that you
Not the airport story.
No, about the kill your darlings. Do you have any darlings that you?
Well, there
dispatched?
were ideas that I would bring up, you know, to our meetings at, you know, coffee house, this coffee house or that coffee house. You know, sometimes we felt like if the story could not be served fully or fairly because of how abbreviated they are, then it would become, well, I'm going to work on that for something else, right? So there were some of those for me. And I was also kind of wrapped up in sort of more trivial interests, right? Like I would say, well, when's Carol Burnett's birthday? Let's write about Carol Burnett just because I like Carol Burnett. And, you know, that's not what our book is about, like right. Anniversaries and birthdays and things like that.
That was one of the rules.
That was a rule.
But we did break that a couple of times.
Yeah.
So when Lucy Lesueur was born in San Antonio, we did note that. And she's better known as Joan Crawford.
Yeah.
And so she was born in San Antonio on the east side in a shack. And she went on to, she won an Oscar for
to make a few movies.
Yeah, Mildred Pierce and Trog. And so that was this interesting story to me. It was the fact that you don't really associate her with San Antonio and her born in abject poverty and how she clawed her way up to being the powerful businesswoman and movie star that she was.
But any other darlings?
There's a lot of things that were like, well, we couldn't really make work. We really couldn't prove some things.
That was a lot of it too, was not being able to cross-reference something that we were onto that we wanted to include. And so that was definitely something we brushed up against quite a bit.
Yeah, we really needed to find some multiple sourcing for some stories that we saw. And going back to how unreliable the newspapers were at the time, it seems like some of the stuff that in those newspapers going back to the 20s and 30s, and they must have just made stuff up. Just had a whole cloth.
Fake news?
Like fake news. They just couldn't, there was no documented proof. It's like, okay, they claim a guy on the south side strikes oil in his backyard, you know, and you're going, wow, this is crazy. I mean, you know, how does it end? And I'm trying to do more research about how, you know, was there oil struck in San Antonio? And it's just like a one-story thing, and it's nothing else about it. And no one else wrote about it. So I'm kind of like, well, this must be just nonsense.
Yeah.
So I moved on. So those types of things.
We have a couple of questions kind of around the same theme. People want to know if you encountered any ghosts in the history of San Antonio, or any legends, or if something, you know, surprised you and changed the popular lore of San Antonio.
Well, I mean, there was the hanging tree and Main Plaza. And so,
That's
you know, and so that's in the comic book, but we write about that. So, and there was like a nursery rhyme or a song that kids would sing in San Antonio about the hanging tree was called Lilly the Moondragon.
Mondragon.
Mondragon. And so, can you read that?
The whole thing?
I mean, yeah, it's just a little nursery rhyme.
A little tree once grew in a street of San Antonio. That little tree we knew as La Ley de Mondragon, which in a street of flowers put forth no blossom fair, yet by the holy powers a ghastly fruit it bare, whose seed was sudden death, whose stem a tight drawn rope. The vigilante saith, well founded is the hope, that the law of Mondragon all Texans will endorse, that here in San Antonio you must not steal a horse. So, but now...
It was on Flores Street. That's
Yeah.
why they saw this.
But no ghosts, no. And then San Antonio is such a
Well,
ghost.
you know, I don't believe in ghosts. So,
I do.
so
It's
if
another
we
book.
couldn't find it, we couldn't document. But to that point, okay, the limitation of San Antonio 365 and trying to be grounded in history and things that we can prove. There's a lot of history here that we really couldn't really kind of squeeze in. I really wanted to. We're trying to find ways to talk about the prehistory of San Antonio, of our native population. And, you know,
He tried.
you know, wanted to talk about that and include that, the beautiful stories that we hear, you know, well, the Yanawana and these other things. It's very important for San Antonio. Try to talk about Indigenous Peoples Day and how they came about in San Antonio and other things. Very important, but that is just, it's not allowed in the format.
Right. We have a little bit of time before we close, just a little bit. Do you have, you know, any personal standout moments that are included in the book? So not, you know, the opposite of Kill Your Darlings. What made it into the book because you loved it so much?
Well, mine happened to be all covered in one of the essays, and that's where I talk about Barbette
Tell that story.
and Miss Wiggles, who was a contortionist. Let me find it really quickly because I'm mindful of the time. So you talk about the one that you wanted to.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about on January 17th, 1976, San Antonians voted 4-1 in favor of stopping the construction of a supermall over the Edwards Aquifer Recharge Zone. And this was a special referendum that was voted on by the city council opposed it. A bunch of very strong-willed women, including my mother, worked very hard to get this referendum before the people of San Antonio, and people voted overwhelmingly in support of protecting our aquifer. And this was basically how San Antonio made it clear that the city needs to keep their hands off the aquifer. Of course, there's some questions about, you know, if that message needs to be reinforced or not. But that's important to me. I remember as a kid going out and getting signatures for petitions to get this on the ballot. And it's important for San Antonio. This was one of these only San Antonio type of stories. We've shown that we are water mindful, and we want to make, and this has a personal connection to me.
Yvette, did you have one?
So no, it's in the July essay. So this talk about the Barbette, whose given name was Vanderclyde Broadway, grew up in Round Rock, Texas at the turn of the century, but was so committed to the idea of basically joining the circus. It's been widely reported that he practiced for hours by walking along his mother's steel clothesline. Eager to strike out on his own, he graduated from high school at age 14, right? So it's these characters that covered in this essay who they're so passionate about something so idiosyncratic. And ultimately they are appreciated, but for the wrong reasons. And they're still chasing the dream. So that's it.
Yeah.
Those are the figures that I admire and stand out for me.
So I think it's time to wrap up. In closing, I want to ask you to read from another essay in the book. The essays are great, you guys. These are really dark times that we're experiencing, and so many people across the country are hurting, whether it's financially because they've lost wages, or they know somebody who has succumbed to COVID-19. Even just reading the news feels like a traumatic event. So I wanted to ask you to read, and please feel free to give any closing remarks, either of you. We talked about it, page 244.
Yes, I'll read that. So this is in the November essay, and it's in the middle. The band REM filmed the video for the song Everybody Hurts in November 1992 on I-10 between Fredericksburg Road and Colorado Street. Audiences have perceived an anti-suicide message in the tune and adopted it as a mental health anthem. Drummer Bill Berry, who penned the song, said it was meant to connect to those who feel no hope. Singer Michael Stipe said the song instantly belonged to everyone except us, and that honestly means the world to me. Most assume that REM stands for Rapid Eye Movement, but over time, the name's origins have become less enigmatic. In a 2007 speech delivered when the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Stipe noted that his grandmother said the acronym stands for Remember Every Moment. The words seem to be a solve rather than an imperative. Remember the good times too, not just those things that bring us to despair.
Thank you. Do you guys have any closing remarks?
We want to thank you.
Lily, thank you so much.
Yeah, and also Trinity University Press. We want to thank Texas Public Radio, everyone who tuned in. We want to thank Bobby for helping us and the Texas Public Radio with helping us set this up and work on this, and Joyce Slocum, President and CEO of Texas Public Radio. And this is a book that we hope will inspire people to take action to improve their city, improve the conditions that we have, fight for social justice, and read about when people's, it's always a struggle, but there is progress that has been made, and more to be won.
It's such a, I feel like such a bond with the city now. It's sort of warts and all, the good, the bad, and the troubling, and also the hope. So that's been sort of what this exercise has been all about for me. So I hope readers will feel that way too, or it will reinforce the love that we have for our city, no matter what, through the challenges and the rest.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for writing this book and for talking with us today. Thank you, Trinity Press. Thank you, Texas Public Radio. You can purchase your copy of San Antonio 365 at local bookstores like The Twig and Barnes & Noble. It's also available online at San Antonio's newest bookstore, Nowhere Bookshop. You can also order a copy at sanantonio365.org. And of course, it's on Amazon, but buy it at one of those other places first. If you enjoyed tonight's conversation, the Maverick Book Club is a monthly series from Trinity University Press that features authors discussing the books that are shaping the narrative landscape of Texas, especially San Antonio. The next will be July 15th at 7 p.m., featuring the book Greetings from San Antonio, Historic Postcards of the Alamo City by Lewis Fisher, in conversation with Ed Conroy of the Southwest School of Art. You can register now for this free event at the Facebook page for Trinity Press, and in the confirmation email, you will receive a link and a promo code to buy the book at a special Maverick Book Club price. So thank you again, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you,
take
everyone.
care and wear a mask.